The candles were still burning. That detail matters. Not because candles are significant in themselves, but because of what it tells you about the timing. The dinner had not ended. The courses had not been cleared. The formal machinery of a royal evening, the toasts, the seating, the careful orchestration of who spoke to whom and when was still in motion. And Diana's chair was empty. She had left the table without announcement, without the social signaling that protocol required, without the whispered word to a neighbor or the quiet gesture to a member of staff that would have made her departure legible. She had simply stood and gone. The table registered it the way formal tables register anything unexpected, slowly, in sections, the awareness moving from the people closest to her chair outward until it reached the end of the room. Camilla was at the table. She had watched Diana leave, and what happened next, in the 40 minutes that followed, documented across the accounts of household staff, personal confidants, and sources who spoke to royal biographers only after sufficient time had passed, was not what anyone at that table had anticipated when they sat down. We are going to come back to exactly what Diana did after she left, but first, you need to understand what had been sitting at that table long before Diana stood up from it, because the chair she vacated was not simply a seat. It was the last position in a room she had been required to occupy correctly for over a decade, and leaving it without a word was the first honest thing the evening had contained. Royal dinners operate on a grammar that has not changed substantially in 200 years. The seating plan is not incidental. It is the evening's primary political document, who sits beside whom, who is placed at the center versus the periphery, whose position at the table communicates elevation, and whose communicates managed distance. All of it is decided in advance, reviewed by senior staff, occasionally adjusted at the last moment when the intelligence about who is currently in favor and who is not has shifted since the invitations went out. Diana had understood this grammar from her first year inside the institution. She had understood that a seating plan was a power map. That proximity to the center communicated significance, that being placed beside someone you had not chosen, night after repeated night at formal occasion after formal occasion, was not a logistical accident. It was a statement about who you were in relation to the institution and what the institution required of you. She had also understood, far earlier than the palace had anticipated, that she could read the map better than most of the people who drew it. By the early 1990s, she had become fluent in a language the institution had assumed was available only to those born inside it. She knew who held actual authority versus ceremonial rank. She knew which advisors were managing Charles and which were managing his image. She knew with a specificity that made certain courtiers visibly uncomfortable, who in any given room had been briefing the press against her, and who had been silent, and what the silence of certain people meant compared to the silence of others. She sat at tables. She read them. And on the evening in question, what she read at that particular table was something she had been reading for years, but had until that night continued to perform as though she had not. The presence of Camilla Parker Bowles at formal royal events during the years of the Wales marriage was managed with an elaborate institutional carefulness that required the active participation of dozens of people. Invitation lists were cross-checked. Arrival times were staggered. Seating plans were constructed to create sufficient distance between the two women that proximity could not produce incident. Staff were briefed. Hosts were quietly informed of the relevant sensitivities. The system worked, largely, because everyone inside it chose to make it work. What the system required, and this is the part that tends to get lost in the tabloid version of events, was the active cooperation of Diana herself. She had to arrive at these events knowing what the seating plan contained. She had to sit in her assigned place. She had to perform the social grammar of the evening, including the grammar of proximity and distance, without acknowledging the architecture that had been constructed specifically around her. She had done this for years, because the alternative, refusing, disrupting, making visible the thing everyone had agreed to perform as invisible, carried costs she was not always willing to pay. Her sons were watching, the institution was watching, the press was watching. Every deviation from the expected behavior of a royal woman in her position would be catalogued, analyzed, used. She had sat at the tables. Until the evening she did not. The specific trigger for Diana's departure from the table has been described slightly differently across various accounts, which is the nature of testimony reconstructed from multiple observers with different vantage points. What every account agrees on is the general shape of what preceded it. The dinner had reached the stage in a formal royal evening when the conversation expands beyond the immediate neighbors and begins to incorporate the wider table. The particular hour when social energy either lifts or flattens, when the evening reveals whether it was designed for genuine gathering or for the performance of gathering. This one was the latter. Diana had been watching it for some time. Not visibly, she was too practiced at maintaining an external surface through long social evenings to allow what she was noticing to register on her face. but internally, with the particular attention of a woman who had spent years reading rooms and finding, in the fine grain of how people arranged themselves and spoke and avoided speaking, the information that the official version of events would never provide. What she was noticing across the course of that dinner was a shifting, a gravitational movement in the social atmosphere of the room, subtle enough to be deniable if questioned but legible to anyone paying the kind of attention Diana paid. The attention moved toward Camilla, the conversations bent in her direction. The men at the table, Charles's circle, the courtiers and friends who had organized their social allegiances in anticipation of a future the institution was already preparing for, addressed themselves to her with a warmth and a naturalness that had not been extended to Diana in that company for some time. Not hostility toward Diana, nothing so direct, simply the gravity of a room that had already decided where its center was. Diana sat with this for the length of 2 courses. Then she put her napkin on the table and she stood. The staff member nearest the door described what happened next in an account preserved by a biographer who spoke with multiple palace sources in the years following Diana's death. Diana had not gone to her apartments. She had not gone to find a telephone or a quiet room to collect herself. She had not done any of the things that a woman removing herself from a distressing social situation might predictably do. She had gone to the kitchen, not in the way that royals sometimes made ceremonial visits to kitchens, the brief choreographed appearance that communicates gracious informality while maintaining the essential distance of rank. She had gone the way Diana went places when she was not performing directly, without announcement, without the social preparation that would have allowed the staff inside to arrange themselves for her arrival. She walked in. The kitchen was mid-service, the noise and heat and controlled urgency of a formal dinner in its middle stages. The staff saw her and moved to adjust, to perform the deference the situation required. She told them not to stop. She sat down on a stool near the preparation counter, and she talked to them. This is the part of the story that the tabloid version cannot accommodate, because the tabloid version requires Diana's exit from the table to be readable as collapse. As the moment when the pressure became too great, when Camilla's presence at the center of a room that had once centered Diana finally broke through the composed surface and produced the instability the palace had always insisted was Diana's fundamental nature. What the staff in that kitchen described was the opposite of collapse. They described a woman who came in from a formal dinner mid-service, sat down among people whose names the institution did not bother to record, and spent 40 minutes being entirely herself. She asked them about their work, not in the manner of patronage, not the performed curiosity of someone fulfilling a social obligation, but with the specific, attentive interest of a woman who had always found the people behind the formal surfaces of royal life more honest and more interesting than the surfaces themselves. She asked one of the junior staff about his family. He told her his wife had recently had a baby. Diana asked the name. He told her. She asked whether the nights were difficult yet. He said they were. She laughed, not the public laugh. The one that arrived when something was genuinely funny to her, sudden, a little too loud for the setting. The laugh of someone who had forgotten, briefly, where she was. She said, "It gets better, I promise, and then it gets worse again, and then it gets better permanently." Tell her from me? Back at the table, the dinner had continued. This is important to hold. The institution's grammar required the evening to proceed regardless of the empty chair, to stop, to acknowledge the departure, to allow the social machinery to pause around Diana's absence. That would have been to admit that her absence meant something. And the institution was not prepared to admit that. So the courses came, the conversation continued. The performances continued. Camilla was at the center of it, in the way she had moved to the center of Charles's world, gradually, then completely, in the manner of something that had always been inevitable making itself finally visible. But the empty chair was visible too. Every person at that table was aware of it. The social mathematics of a formal dinner do not accommodate absences gracefully. The gap sits in the peripheral vision of everyone present, a fact requiring a frame that the evening's official grammar could not provide. And the longer the chair remained empty, the more the question that nobody was asking accumulated weight. Where was she? What was she doing? Was she distressed? Was she making calls? Was she preparing something? The anxiety of not knowing is often more destabilizing than the knowledge of the worst possibility. The table had a worst possibility available, Diana doing something that would require management, that would become a story, that would arrive in the press with the morning and require the institution's response machinery to mobilize. She was in the kitchen, asking about a baby. The contrast between what the table feared and what Diana was actually doing is the whole story. Diana had spoken in her private recordings about what kitchens and back rooms and service corridors meant to her inside royal spaces. She said they were the only places in those buildings where people told her the truth. Not about politics or the marriage or the institution. About ordinary things. about what their days contained, what they were worried about, what made them laugh. The texture of a life that was not organized around the management of perception, she said. When I walked into a room that had been prepared for me, everyone in it had already decided what I was. I was the princess, I was the difficult one, or the radiant one, or the troubled one, depending on what they'd read that week. But in the places they hadn't prepared, the kitchens, the corridors, the rooms where the work actually happened, I was just a person who had come in from somewhere else. She said I could breathe in those rooms. That sentence is the key to the entire evening. The formal dinner, with its seating plan and its gravitational drift toward Camilla and its candles and its performance of a social order that Diana had already been quietly written out of. That room had not been prepared for her in any sense that mattered. It had been prepared for the role she was expected to continue playing. The kitchen had not been prepared for her at all. She could breathe. The humiliation the title of this story promises requires clarification, because what Diana did that evening was not a calculated strategy to embarrass Camilla. She was not running a counter-operation. She was not thinking about the optics of her absence or the story it would produce or the way it would read against the image of Camilla at the center of a table Diana had vacated. She was sitting in a kitchen talking about a baby. The humiliation was structural, unintentional, produced not by anything Diana designed but by the collision between who she actually was and what the evening had required her to be. Camilla was at the center of a room performing the role of a woman who belonged there. Diana was in the kitchen being a person no performance was required of. When the story of that evening eventually circulated, as these things circulated, through the networks of household staff and social observers and confidants who were the real archive of royal life, it did not circulate as a story about Diana's distress. It circulated as a story about her freedom. That was what Camilla could not match. Not the dress, not the public adoration, not the two sons or the global profile or the causes or the cameras. Those could be waited out, outlasted, inherited through proximity and time. The freedom to leave a table mid-dinner and go sit in a kitchen and laugh about a baby, that was not transferable. It belonged to Diana because it came from something the institution had tried for 16 years to remove from her, and had never quite managed to reach. She returned to the table before the dinner ended. This is also important. She did not make the departure permanent. She did not turn the exit into a statement by refusing to return. She came back, took her seat, resumed the social grammar of the evening as though she had stepped away briefly, which, in her own internal accounting, she had. The table received her return with the particular relief of a formal gathering that had spent 40 minutes managing the anxiety of the unknown, and was now permitted to release it. Conversations resumed. The evening moved toward its conclusion. Camilla was still at the center of the room. That had not changed. But something else had shifted. In the 40 minutes Diana had been absent, something that the people in that room registered without being able to name. The performance had continued without her. The table had managed, the institution's grammar had held, and Diana had not been part of any of it. She had been somewhere else entirely, in a room that did not require anything of her except her actual self, laughing about something real. The question the table had asked in her absence, what is she doing, what is she preparing, had an answer that no one there had predicted. Nothing. She was doing nothing that required preparation. She was just being Diana. There is a final image from that evening worth carrying. The staff member whose baby Diana had asked about, the one whose wife had recently given birth, whose nights were difficult, who had been promised it would get better, described the moment she left the kitchen to return to the dinner. She stood up from the stool, she straightened the dress. She looked at the room briefly, the heat, the noise, the controlled urgency of people doing necessary work inside a building whose formal surfaces depended entirely on what happened in rooms like this one. She said, "Thank you," not in the way royals said, "thank you" as a social formality. In the way a person said it when they meant it precisely, when gratitude was the accurate word for what the preceding 40 minutes had been. Then she walked back to the table. The candles were lower now. The dinner was approaching its end. She took her seat. She said nothing about where she had been. She did not need to. The 40 minutes had already said everything.